Hi everybody, welcome to Paul Programs. Today we're going to be talking about animation, but we're going to really focus on 2D animation and how we can use 2D animation in games. First, we'll take a look at some history behind 2D animation, then we'll see how 2D animation gets done in games, and lastly, we'll jump into Unity and see how we can actually use 2D animation in our own games. Some of you are wondering, where did 2D animation actually begin? And there's several discussions on how and where it began, but we're not entering that debate. But what we will do is take a look at one of the devices that was pivotal in 2D animation, and I'm talking about the zoetrope. Basically, it was a device created by William Horner in 1834. It was in the shape of a drum or think cylinder, and it had several slits on the side, and on opposite of the slits would be some frame of animation. And as it rotates, if you look in one space, you'll actually see the animation because the different frames are passing by where you're looking. So this is actually a great device because it incorporates a lot of the ideas used in game development when it comes to 2D animation. A few people and groups are actually responsible for getting animation to where it is today. One of the most known is Walt Disney, who actually pushed the medium forward with his animated short, Steamboat Willie, which basically introduced us all to Mickey Mouse. Also, other groups that were really big for pushing the medium forward in the 1930s was Hanna-Barbera and Warner Brothers. Their animations created iconic characters such as Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, and so on and so forth. But without these groups, we wouldn't have a lot of the practices and standards for 2D animation that we actually have today. So these groups help set the guidelines for where we are today, and those guidelines also help inform how animation's handled within games as well. And that covers our quick look at a simple history of 2D animation. If anyone's interested in learning more about animation, there's so many resources on the internet you can just jump in and get lost for hours. Alright, now let's take a look at how we actually can accomplish animation in games. But first we'll have to look at some techniques that pretty much overlap from standard 2D animation and game animation. Where the difference is from standard 2D animation to games is instead of having basically giant frame sheets where they actually put the animation and frames on, in games you're going to actually have animation broken up into a sprite sheet, and the sprite sheet has several sections which represent each frame of animation, and you may have a sprite sheet represent a single character or several different types of characters, but basically your sprite sheet is, think of like a grid with several frames of animation on it that'll be used. Sprite sheets you don't only have to use for frames of animation, you can also use them to put static elements that you'll actually move around the level. Like take a cloud in Super Mario. While Mario is moving one way and animating his walk movement, a cloud may be moving the other way, but if you notice, the cloud doesn't actually ever really change or animate or have any kind of action going to it. It's just moving across the screen. Alright. So that covers pretty much the two main components. Let's jump into Unity now and see how we can build these two components into a game. Now we're in our Unity project. So you can see we have an empty scene set up. We're going to want to actually add a sprite to represent our player. So then, as you can see right here in the hierarchy, we'll just call that one player. And then we're going to want to create a second sprite for a static object. So in this case, we're actually just going to call it guard, and it'll make sense in a moment why that name was chosen. So now we're going to actually look at our settings, and you can see there's actually no sprite set up. So we're actually going to go into our sprites folder, and you can see we have 3 different sprites loaded in. These are PNG files which have transparencies to represent our sprites and sprite sheets. So let's actually take a look at the player first. So if we head over to our inspector, you can see texture type. When working with sprites, you want to make sure this is set to sprite, 2D and UI. Also, if you're working with sprite sheets that are going to have multiple frames, you're going to want to make sure the sprite mode is set to multiple. And then to actually set up each of the different frames, you'll click here on Sprite Editor, and you can set up different frames by drawing a rectangle and resizing based on the different frames you have and what size they are. After that's done, you can apply and it'll actually set it to your sprite sheet. So if we close here and collapse this arrow, you can see all the different frames created are spliced out here, and you can see them down here by the inspector. So that pretty much covers the basics of creating your sprite sheets. Now, let's just take a quick look at the other two sprites we have, which are Bodyguard and Bodyguard 2, which only consist of a single frame, and those are just set to single because the whole frame is pretty much your sprite. And we're going to be animating these in a very different way that isn't the same as the way you would with a sprite sheet. Now let's actually attach our sprites to the objects we created in the scene. So this one will be set to player stand. And then this one here will be set to bodyguard. All right, and then we'll do some resizing. So we'll make him a little bit less of a chunky boy. And we're going to send him to the back. And then our player, we're gonna 0, 0, 0. And then we're gonna scale him up a bit because he's quite tiny. Also, when scaling, you wanna make sure that your sprite is set to point. The reason is that when you set it to bilinear, it'll add like a fuzz and you lose that really crisp pixel style. So if that's what you're going for, bilinear will work. But if you want that really crisp pixel style, you'll want to set it to point. All right, so I did some quick adjustments to just where all our sprites were located. Now let's actually jump in and figure out how to create animations. So we'll go Window, and then we'll select Animation, and that'll bring up our animation window. In our animation window, whatever object is selected, we'll have the ability to actually create an animator and different animation clips. So let's create one for our player right now. Right? We'll give it a name. So in this case, we'll just call it player work. Yes, we're going to replace it. And then we're going to actually add a clip. So our first clip's already set. So let's add a property to it. And basically what the property is our way of selecting different aspects that we may want to animate. In this case, since we're just doing different frames of the sprite, we would actually just select sprite. And that basically creates our first line of animation. Okay, now that we're here, we're going to want to actually create our walk. So there's two ways we can edit this. We can either drag our sprites directly in, which is the easiest way. So in this case, we want to replace this guy, and then we're actually going to want to alternate between all of them. So as you can see, let's see, you here, stand in the middle, and then here. So it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Actually, oh, we missed a stand, so you're actually a stand, and you're actually a walk. All right, so this pretty much covers our walk animation, and as you can see, it'll be alternating between walking and standing sprites, so it gives the look that he's actually taking steps. And to show it, we can actually check our scene here, down in the bottom, so let's go player, and then if we hit play, see, we can see our animation in action, and that pretty much covers that bit. To add more animation clips, you would hit create new clip. So if we want to do one for standing, we can do a player stand one. And then if we want to do one for jumping, we can do one called player jump. And the same as before, we can either add a property or we can actually just drag our player sprite right in there, and it handles all the work for us, and then we can actually drag in all the different components. So say we want here, land is about there, so we're actually going to drag this one really close, and then this is about the halfway point, and then we actually want the player once they land to be back in walk, so we'll set that here. See? And that'll cover basically our jumping animation. And again, we could preview it and boom, there we go. With the basics of player animation covered, now let's take a look at our guard. With our guard, we're actually going to animate in a very different way. So let's go create, and we're going to call this guard breathing. So we're going to add a property again, but we're actually going to edit the sprite's transform. So we're going to actually choose scale, and if you click here, you can actually add a keyframe. Keyframes are the different frames that you transition between. So as you saw with the player sprite, we had several keyframes representing different parts of the walk motion. Here we're going to add a keyframe, and then during this keyframe we're actually going to edit the scale and make the guard slightly bigger. So now if we actually take a look at our guard down there and we hit play, you can see it's like he's breathing. See, and Unity handles a lot of the in-between of getting from the smaller size to the bigger size back to the smaller size. One last thing we want to take a look at before we actually jump into code is our Animator screen. So again, you can go Window, Animation, select Animator, but in this case we already have it open. When you actually create your different states and clips, it'll list them here without any connections, except for your first one, which is your entry to that. In this case, it's set to be player standing as our initial animation state. If you wanted to add transitions from one state to another, you would actually right click, make transition, and you can drag this arrow from one transition to the other. And then you can rinse and repeat. As you can see, we have player going from stand to walk, from walk back to stand, and then from stand to jump, and jump back to stand, and we also have from walk to jump. But what really matters most are these transitions. These are going to be the bread and butter. So to make the transitions actually work, the most important thing is to actually set parameters up. So here we have two parameters already set, but if you wanted to create your own parameter, you would just hit the plus here and choose the type of value you want to look at. Then when you actually call the animator in your script, you can actually set these values based on whatever thing you're trying to do to cause the animation to happen. So if we click here, we can see the parameter from from standing to walking is player speed, and we're making sure that it's greater than 0. So if the player is moving more than 0, then it's going to set that animation to true and to play. If it's less than, then it'll actually set it back from walk to stand. So this is pretty much the brains behind the animations that go on in 2D. So now let's jump into some code and see how we can make this brain work for us and our player animations. All right, the first script we're going to take a look at is our background script, which is going to be used on the guards. We have a speed set for them, and we also have when the player presses the D key, it's going to move them to the left off the screen. The idea is that when the player is walking, anything in the background is moving opposite direction of the direction the player is supposed to be moving in. Here, we have the test animation script, which will be used on the player. The first thing we're going to do is set up our variables. So as you can see here, we have an animator set up, which will grab the animator on the player. We have a boolean for seeing if the player's jumped or not. And then we have a jump time, which will track how long the player's been jumping for. And then we have a stop jump time to see if the player's jump time has hit that and reset it. So now we have our start. In our start, we're actually going to get the animator that's attached to our player object. So animator, then we'll do transform.getComponent animator, and that'll get our animator off the player object. Next, we have our update function. In our update function, we check for player inputs. So in this case, we're just checking for the D key and the space bar. If the D key is pressed, then it's going to set the player to walk. As soon as the key is released, it'll stop the player from walking. And then if we press the space bar, it's going to set jumping to true. And then it's going to set the jumping animation. And it's also going to move the player's position to represent the idea of jumping. Right now, we're just jumping up in location, kind of teleporty, but this is just to show the idea. And then, while the player's jumping, we're going to be tracking how long the player's been jumping for. Once the player's hit its max jump time, it's actually going to set jump to 0. It's going to make sure the player is not jumping any longer, and then it's going to stop the player's jumping animation. So because we set these in the animator, when we actually call these different numbers and values pushed to these IDs, it'll relate back to the animations and the parameters we set back when we did it in the animator phase. Alright, so we finished putting together our code and have all of our animations and the animator all set. Now let's actually take a look what this looks like in action. So let's hit our play button, give Unity a moment to heat up the engines, and as you can see, our guards are doing their pulsing action as we showed before, like they're breathing and standing in place, and then when you hit the D key, the player actually walks, leaving them in the dust. All the animations we created are in there, and if you wanted to, you can add the ability to flip the player, so there are ways to flip sprites. You can add different speeds. If you want, you can make the actual guards do something else besides pulsing. You can even have them shift or shimmy. There's all sorts of pretty much options that we have, but the gist is to get an understanding of the two ways we can use animation and how they can be implemented. And with that, that covers our look at how you can actually use 2D animation in a Unity game. So hopefully you were all able to learn a little bit about 2D animation and how you can incorporate it into your own games. If you're interested in checking out the code, click the GitHub link below. Also, if you want, you can leave comments, suggestions, or questions below as well. Like and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.